1315, the forgotten apocalypse that starved the world. Imagine going to sleep in spring with a full sack of seed in the barn and waking to find that seed sodden, mold-streaked, and useless. Imagine the millstone silent, the oven cold, and the market square where baskets of bread used to sit now quiet as an empty church pew. That is how a continent on the rise suddenly discovered its own fragility. This is not the usual catastrophe you picture. No army marching, no single volcano, no sudden disease that sweeps cities. It begins in weather, a season that will not stop raining, a summer that never warms, but rain is only the gesture. What mattered was how 1,000 small failures, wet seed, flooded furrows, spoiled storehouses, broken roads, tied together into a vast, slow-motion collapse. By the time chroniclers could put pen to parchment, whole regions would be hungry, and the mechanisms of medieval life would creak and fail under strain. We will follow that cascade, the flourishing world that preceded 1315, the climate shock that started it, the daily choices that became desperate, and the echoes that shaped the centuries that followed. If you like deep dive history, subscribe. Before the crisis, there was abundance enough to be dangerous. For a century or more, Europe, especially the Northwest, had been expanding. Populations rose, new fields were broken out of woodland, more crops were grown, often on newly reclaimed marginal ground. Markets multiplied. Towns became hubs not just for craftsmen, but for flows of grain, salt, and credit. Monasteries, manors, and merchants all took part in a kind of pre-modern globalization. Grain from one valley could feed a guild in a port town, and surplus in one year became seed and capital for the next. That prosperity disguised risks. Farming was still overwhelmingly seasonal. A family depended on the harvest they could put in the ground the previous autumn, and the handful of bushels kept through winter. Storage exists, but medieval granaries, cellars, and barns are built for a buffer, a cushion of months, not a reserve for repeated failure. The manorial economy lived through obligations to a local lord, labor services and rents paid in kind, converted peasant labor into predictable flows of produce and payments. Markets further smoothed seasonal shortages, but they also connected regions. A port could draw grain from dozens of miles away. Those connections were stabilizing when trade flowed as expected. They became conduits of vulnerability when transport failed. A single failed harvest could be absorbed. 2 bad seasons were painful, but the catastrophe that breaks a society is rarely a single event. It is a sequence. The year that starves is rarely the only one. Contemporary climatologists reconstruct a string of exceptionally wet, cool years beginning in 1315 and continuing into 1316 and 1317. Tree rings, sediment layers, and the notes of monks and town clerks point to a pattern. Prolonged rains in spring and summer, fields that could not be sown or that rotted after sowing, and successive shortfalls that exhausted local stores. Seed that sat damp in barns failed to germinate. Hay and fodder for animals became scarce, so livestock weakened, and many died or had to be slaughtered early. Where fields once promised, reaped abundance, the furrows held water and mud. The first human effects were immediate and global in tone, local in experience. Bread, the staple, responds to weather faster than laws or custom. When the next loaf takes 10, 20, or 50% more grain to make, prices rise. Merchants and townsmen saw bread prices spike within months of the first failed harvest, and a city that imported grain found its usual sellers absent, its contracts unfulfilled. A country family that had always kept enough seed to sow the spring found their storehouse full of blackened, mildewed sacks. Around them, the judgment of the manor, rents, labor days, obligations, did not pause for weather. One way to understand 1315 is through the lives of a few archetypes: the peasant, the merchant, the monk. In a village tucked between low hills, a peasant couple wake to a barn of soft, blackened grain. The husband has a labor obligation due to the Lord's steward. The steward, watching his own shortfall, cannot be persuaded to accept less. The couple have options: sell tools and household goods to pay a hidden cash levy, try to leave for a town where charity might be found, or wait and watch their children waste. Migration increases. Those who can lift a cart forfeit their last savings and walk toward the walled towns. But towns are not reservoirs of kindness. They are competitive markets. Carts arrive with desperate peasants and prices surge. A baker in a port town who once relied on regular shipments now finds the harbor quiet. Ships that used to bring grain from the continent remain at anchor, their cargoes turned inward to feed home markets. He hoards a week's supply, hoping the next ship will come, and when it does not, he raises prices a notch more. In a monastery, the cellarer counts loaves and barrels differently. Monastic houses were often centers of relief. They had grain, perceived or real stores, and a theological imperative to feed the hungry. Yet monasteries were not endless pantries. They also depended on rents and tithes, and their own lands suffered the same weather. Many abbeys and priories opened their gates to the destitute, but as visitors swelled and supplies shrank, even the disciplined routines of monastic charity frayed. Some houses organized soup kitchens and extended alms more systematically. Others found themselves pleading with wealthy patrons or trying to buy grain on markets where it no longer existed at reasonable price. Markets are worth a longer look because governance and human decisions there shaped whether famine remained local or became regional. Grain trades worked on expectations. Sellers withheld stock when they feared prices would rise further. Buyers hoarded if they thought the current price would become unaffordable tomorrow. Transport depended on passable roads, functioning carts, and safe bridges, conditions that failed in soggy seasons. Rivers that normally delivered cargo became mud-choked. In some towns, municipal authorities attempted price controls, public bakers were commissioned, or grain was imported at public expense. In other places, gates were closed to outsiders to prevent waves of hungry migrants from overwhelming resources. Those measures, sometimes compassionate, sometimes brutal, reveal how social trust frays in scarcity. The social consequences of prolonged hunger are brutally diverse. Theft increases, not always as criminal malice, but as the arithmetic of survival. Begging becomes more common, and the language of charity shifts as more people claim need. Some lords, facing depleted harvests on their domain, remit rents in part or accept labor service in place of grain. Others, trying to uphold fiscal balances or prestige, insist on dues being paid, even as peasants default. That enforcement breeds resentment. Chroniclers of the time, writing from monasteries, town halls, or royal courts, describe riots at market fairs, the blocking of roads, and confrontations at manor gates. Religious responses are varied too. Processions and public penance become common as clergy and laity attempt to interpret or avert divine anger. Sermons exhort repentance and prayers are multiplied, but religion can also become a lens for blame. Outsiders and marginal groups may be scapegoated. Accusations of sorcery or malfeasance sometimes follow famine as communities search for causal agents. All of this unfolded differently in city and countryside. Cities, if they could draw on wider trade networks, sometimes managed to avoid complete collapse by purchasing grain from afar, provided transport routes held, and there were sellers. Rural areas more remote from trade suffered when local stores failed and no market rescue arrived. But towns also concentrated the hungry. Urban populations that could not be fed in place pushed outward, carrying contagions of poverty into neighboring districts. The spatial pattern of suffering was patchy. One valley might have been spared a winter's worst while the next showed clear signs of distress. This mosaic made governance hard. Kings, bishops, and local lords all had limited overlapping tools. Institutional responses were uneven. Some manor courts allowed rents to be delayed or accepted reduced payments. Some merchants set up credit arrangements accepting futures on grain that barely existed because they expected the market to recover. Municipalities that possessed fiscal muscle bought grain to sell at reduced rates in the public market. Royal authorities in some kingdoms attempted to restrict grain export, believing locally produced food should not leave hungry subjects. But restrictions could backfire. Preventing grain from moving to where prices were highest reduced incentives for traders to run risky transport, and in some areas the absence of trade meant that local scarcities persisted longer. These were not simple policy failures. They were attempts made in ignorance of how sustained and regionally coordinated the problem had become. We must say something about demographic effects, but cautiously. Contemporary scholars caution against neat, headline-grabbing figures. There is no consensus that a single famine killed a fixed proportion of the continent. Instead, evidence suggests a mix: increased mortality among the most vulnerable, infants, the elderly, those already weakened by poor diets, combined with a drop in birth rates as families postponed having children in an uncertain world. The cumulative result was a slowdown in population growth across the affected years, and that in turn had economic consequences. Fewer able-bodied workers in the short term changed labor markets and could alter land use decisions. In some places, marginal land may have been abandoned, and in others, labor shortages may have pushed wages up for those who remained. Culturally, the Great Famine left marks in memory. Chronicles record months of rain, towns sending delegations to begging villages, and clergy pleading with congregations for charity. Artists and poets, when they mention hunger, do so with metaphors of emptiness, empty bowls, bare fields, and the palpable absence of the usual seasonal rhythms. These records do not always capture the voices of the hungry themselves, but they do reveal a new awareness among elites. Prosperity could evaporate, markets could fail, and institutions were not automatic safeguards. One uncomfortable reality is that human responses often compounded the crisis. Hoarding, price speculation, and the refusal of some landowners to adjust rents created feedback loops that amplified shortages. Markets, which under ordinary circumstances help distribute food to where it is needed, can also be channels of failure when trust breaks. When transport lines fail, when sellers withhold supply, and when legal constraints like export bans cut across the logic of distribution, food accumulates in some places and disappears in others. In some regions, this meant bread became an urban luxury. In others, rural households were reduced to eating what the land could still yield: roots, leaves, and anything else that did not rely on a successful grain harvest. It is important to emphasize shades of solidarity, too. Not every response was selfish. Local relief, neighbors sharing a single loaf among many, monasteries opening gates, towns organizing public soup kitchens, did much to blunt the worst effects where it could be mustered. Some communities developed informal insurance mechanisms, common stores, reciprocal labor arrangements, and temporary exemptions from customary dues. Yet the scale of the crisis often overwhelmed these measures. Charity attenuated suffering but seldom restored normalcy. The long tale of 1315 is worth tracking. Short-term suffering translated into medium-term changes. Landowners who had once rented small plots might consolidate holdings if tenants abandoned land. Landlords could convert arable to pasture if grazing demanded less labor and promised steadier returns in a volatile market. Urban economies adapted by diversifying supply lines, encouraging domestic storage, or creating institutional grain reserves in some cases. Fiscal pressures pushed rulers to reconsider taxation in crisis-prone years. In social terms, the famine altered negotiations between peasant and lord, between market and municipality, and between church and laity. Whether these shifts led to immediate political upheaval depended on local conditions. In some regions, they hardened grievances that would resurface decades later. There is also a larger historical logic. 1315 did not happen in a vacuum. It was one of several shocks in a century that would include crop failures, war, and later a devastating pandemic. Each event interacted with the others in ways historians study with caution. It would be wrong, for instance, to say that the famine alone caused subsequent demographic collapses or political revolutions. Still, it is plausible to consider the famine as a stress test for medieval institutions. Where governance at local and regional levels was robust and flexible, people fared better. Where systems were brittle, the social fabric frayed more quickly. Finally, what does 1315 teach us about vulnerability? The Great Famine is a reminder that complexity brings both strengths and fragility. A network of markets and trade makes a region prosperous in abundant years. The same network can spread scarcity rapidly when shocks close nearly every node at once. Food systems that rely on timely planting, predictable transport, and modest storage have little immunity to successive bad seasons. And when power is decentralized, lords, municipalities, churches sharing responsibilities, coordination becomes the decisive factor. In a way, the tragedy of 1315 is modern. It shows how human systems designed to smooth uncertainty can become instruments of crisis when those uncertainties are prolonged beyond expectable bounds. There is no neat moral here, only the stubborn fact of contingency. The people who suffered in 1315 were not lacking in courage or industry. They were living under a set of institutions and technologies that had worked very well until a run of unlucky years revealed their limits. Remembering that forgotten apocalypse matters because it is not just about medieval lives, It is about the perennial mismatch between human expectations and the caprices of nature. If you want to dig deeper into the sources behind this episode, chronicle excerpts, tree ring studies, and modern syntheses, check the description for a reading list and links to primary scholarship. And if this kind of long-form history interests you, watch our next episode, where we track how successive crises in the 14th century reshaped European labor markets and town governance.